I think on our side, Risha, we are good to go. You can then, kickstart.
Okay, sure. Um, so as Prof said, I think I got a little bit of the conversation as you guys were chatting. But basically, good afternoon and thank you for joining us for the seminar this afternoon. It is really lovely to see everyone, and I think we are all definitely looking forward to this important discussion on public-private partnerships as it impacts society on various levels and in various ways. So, before we begin, please note that the proceedings will be recorded and it will also be made available on the ISER YouTube channel and across our other social media platforms. So I hope everyone is okay with the seminar being recorded. So my name is Risha Kara and I'm the hosting chair this afternoon. So before we begin, I'm just going to spend a few minutes on sharing a little background on the ISER. So we have four key research areas, which include environmental resources management, cross-border trade in Africa, skills development, and education research. And then lastly, today's topic, which looks at sustainable private and public partnerships, speaks to the fourth research area, which is human and economic development. So public-private partnerships as a way of financing public sector projects through the private sector has emerged as a more acceptable and beneficial alternative to privatization. These types of projects require a specific perspective and skill set for its detailed development and successful implementation. And as seen in recent years, have had an impact on the development of various industries globally. So while the benefits may seem invaluable and of great promise to emerging economies like South Africa, public-private partnerships present major challenges, which, if not adequately addressed, may undermine their very purpose and lead to a distortion of public sector priorities during infrastructure development decisions. So a prime example of such a challenge includes the current service delivery issue that South Africa is faced with and how these are deeply infringing on people's human rights. So to give us more insight into how public-private partnerships can be a vehicle of change in addressing such pertinent issues, it is my pleasure to warmly welcome and introduce Professor Luella Mila, who is our speaker for today. So Prof is a project procurement management systems expert by trade and a B2 rated NRF researcher. He is also the joint coordinator at the International Council for Research and Innovation in Building and Construction, which is an institute that focuses on construction in developing countries. And is also a visiting professor at the Leeds Beckett University in the United Kingdom and here at the Institute of Social and Economic Research at Rhodes University. And then lastly, adding to this illustrious career is the more than 200 peer-reviewed journal articles, conference proceedings, research and study reports, which Prof has authored. Now, responding to the presentation, I also have the privilege of introducing Professor Pierce from the Rhodes Business School, and he lectures on the MBA and postgraduate diploma in enterprise management programs, as well as on various other executive short courses. He has also authored and co-authored numerous journal articles, books, book chapters, and conference papers. Furthermore, Prof. Pierce is also a registered industrial psychologist and has consulted and conducted training on behalf of the National Parliament, various government departments, NGOs, and private companies, and this includes some extensive work done in the automotive industry and the education sector. So a heartfelt thank you to Prof. Ruwelamila and Pierce for taking the time to be with us this afternoon. And also both of the profs' full bios can be viewed on the advert for the seminar that was circulated. So we certainly anticipate a very thought-provoking and engaging discussion, which unpacks some compelling examples of various private partnership developments across both emerging and industrialized economies. So just a little bit of housekeeping. The seminar will work as follows. So firstly, Prof. Ruwelamila will present for about 25 minutes, and that will then be followed by a response from Prof. Pierce for about 10 minutes. And thereafter, we will have a time for questions and comments. So we will do questions, since it's a hybrid system, we will do questions online and in person, but we will explain a bit more about that during the question and answer session. But for those who are joining online, please, as the seminar is unfolding, you're welcome to post your questions in the chat box, and we will then attend to them at the end of the seminar. Sorry. And then for those who are attending in person, we will then obviously address those questions at the seminar at the end of the seminar as well. So without further delay, it is definitely my pleasure to welcome Prof. Ruwelamila and then to hand over to him. Thank you, Prof.
Yep. Thank you very much, Risha.
Pleasure.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen.
Afternoon.
I think first of all, although you are not going to see my face, but I thought I should show you my face first, because you might think actually probably they have arranged for a robot to talk to you. Yeah, that's me. And then I would like to probably just indicate to you that for some time, public-private partnerships has been part of the work which I've been involved in practice, as well as part of my teaching at the university and elsewhere. And partly, of course, I've been part of the debates. If you one day you go through Google, you may get one of my paper where I talk about the first P. I think you'll be able to see that this debate has been going on for some time, and you'll be able to probably understand where I'm coming from. So probably as a starting point, I just want to say that South Africa is a laboratory for PPP. And I use the words laboratory with confidence, but at the same time with sadness. The confidence probably for me, for a PPP, I look at some of the national roads, and then I look at the Gautrain in Gauteng. But then at the same time, I look at the e-toll with a very sad face, indeed. So whenever I talk about PPP, I don't forget those two sides of the PPP environment in South Africa: sadness and happiness. I would like to probably then project my presentation. I think it looks like I've got a stop sharing sign there. Hopefully I can open that now, and then I'll be able to just project my PowerPoint. I hope you can see it coming.
Yes.
We can see it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I
you.
think, yeah, thank you very much for somebody who arranged this. It's no problems at all. Yeah, I think as Risha has actually introduced me, I'm actually going to talk about sustainable public-private partnerships. And I'm looking at PPPs, of course, from the strategic public projects point of view. And my intention actually is to try and probably move away from the popular arguments which you find in the street, where people will talk about PPP, some for and some against. But when you listen very careful, you'll actually find that some of the issues which are raised, they don't really show a good understanding of what PPPs are. And I will raise some points, and probably at the time when we start probably deliberating at the end, probably we'll actually be able to see where to from here. So it's a sustainable public-private partnership for strategic public projects in South Africa, and I would like to take some lessons from others. Lessons from others, because there have been a number of issues which have come out. And I start from Winch's argument when he talks about the modern societies and he talks about generating new value. And I look at generating new value for me in the context of a fixed capital formation, for example. And when I look at that, I'm not confining PPP into fixed capital formation, but just for this paper, I would like to focus on that particular aspects. And so my starting point, therefore, is actually to acknowledge that a public-private partnership, as we know it, is a way of financing public sector projects through the private sector. Whether you go to the UK, where they will talk about PFI, the public finance initiatives, or you'll go to the US, where they talk about PPP, but you'll actually find that in most situations they are talking about the same thing. So under a PPP initiative, we are going to see actually later on a private company handles the upfront costs instead of the government, and in return, obviously, the government authority makes payment to the private company over the long term. So there are issues there which I will explain. But my interest, therefore, in this particular situation is actually to acknowledge that PPP could actually contribute significantly to sustainable infrastructure. And ranging from whether we are talking about maintenance, we're talking about repair, or we are talking about hydroelectric dams, power plants, gas pipelines, you name it. It is possible to bring in the private arm to be able to deal with those. But it is the challenges which I'm concerned about because of why PPP hasn't actually come out strongly in various aspects related to infrastructure development. Now, I thought I should start probably by taking away certain myths. And the one myth actually is connected with what I call global support for PPPs, where you'll find actually that there are arguments which have come out from various organizations, especially the G20, where there is a question of arguing that advantages of PPPs are very transformational. They talk about transformational projects. And I think later on, I'll be able to comment on that particular situation. Because if you look at the take on PPPs across emerging economies, I think it hasn't been to the level of what has been said. And in my view, there are reasons why that hasn't happened. So when we look at through the window and we see PPPs, I think we normally have mixed reactions, as I've already indicated. And I said South Africa is a good laboratory for PPP, especially if I look at the ETOL and I look at Gautrain and I look at the national roads and what have you. So I think it is right, therefore, for me to talk about that there are criticisms of PPP in emerging economies. And probably I may even use the point that PPPs are facing a bit of negativity, which I would like probably to place in the position of adversity. And probably that may not actually be the real situation of what PPPs are. But I want to use that adversity to be able to unpack some of the issues which I want us to talk about. And these criticisms have been coming from the civil society groups. And if you look very closely, read and listen, the trade unions and others, when they criticize, the criticisms are mostly ideological. And there are mixed opinions there in terms of whatever they say. And when you start picking one at a time, you'll ask yourself whether you can understand the stories in terms of what they are criticizing, and sometimes not. So for me, I've been following up some of these criticisms, and I've been following some of the other group of people who have used what I call the evidence-based critique of PPPs, and which I feel comfortable with. And I feel actually that I would like, therefore, to use this as a point of focus when I talk to you today. So if we are talking about the face of adversity, therefore, I just want to look at what I've noticed to be the challenges. And these are under those points which I've indicated there. First of all, asking the question, how prevalent is the usage of PPPs in emerging economies like South Africa? And I'll put my word there, and I'll have to qualify that word. There is a bit of elitism. When people talk about PPPs, it's like somebody's saying, oh, don't get involved because you won't understand. But then you ask the person to pay when you don't want them to understand. And the second aspect which I want to talk about is the cost and profit associated with PPP projects. And then I would like to open up a little bit on the significant outlay which are involved in preparing PPP projects. And then talk about PPP project struggle, the question of attracting commercial financing, and talk about how developmental, probably as a question, are PPP projects. And then I think lastly, before we conclude, I just want to talk about the institutional and the political challenges that limit PPP project success. And there are issues there of projects and what has happened across the world. So I think my starting point probably should be, again, revisiting the definition. There is no universal definition of a PPP, although you'll find actually that I like Klein's definition when he talks about private participation. Now in infrastructure sectors like telecoms, transport, and what have you, and they're talking about activities that fall under this umbrella. It refers them sometimes to be characterized, for example, as concessions, franchise, or build, operate, transfer deals. Now, when you are defining PPPs, I think it is very important to understand that there is a group of them, and I'm going to therefore move out of my presentation and go for three of my PowerPoints, which I wanted to explain a few aspects on that particular definition, so that probably I can get it more clear. And I call these additions. And what are they? I think first of all is just to be able to acknowledge, as you can see in front of you, that PPPs, it's an umbrella notion, and they cover so many things, from specific services to new assets, and then to management and the new assets. So you'll find all sorts of things there: management and service contracts, design, build, operate, transfer, lease contracts, concession contracts, and asset sales. So PPP can fall under all these, and you'll find actually that if there are tariffs which are supposed to be collected, you'll see actually where they are collected. The first three collected by the public, but the last three collected by the private sector. And then when you look at the asset ownership, the first and the second one more by public, and then the third one can either be private or it can be public. And then you'll find the lease contracts can be public, and then of course the others, concessions and asset sales, could be private. Now, the one which we call asset sales, although people will say it's PPP, for me, I think it is just a sale out. And I think probably when I talk about PPP, I think I stop at what we call concession contracts, because the asset sales for me, if it goes to the private, then it is gone. But the others, from there upwards, I think those they remain as PPP. And when you look at the risk assessment, you'll quite clearly see that you have got the sovereign risks and the sub-sovereign risks, and you can see actually the assessment of those which will affect the bottom line of those particular projects. The other aspect which I think is important to understand beyond these particular aspects of a variety of PPPs is to look at this curve, which shows you when you are looking at the forms of partnerships, where you can see actually that you can have 100% public ownership, which is a traditional way of actually providing infrastructure. But on the other side, you can have a 100% non-public ownership. And you can see, when you look at that line, you'll actually see that the government's role, where it is, and then you can see the increasing level of delegation and the risk irreversibility. And as you can see that actually, when you talk about a proper PPP, most of the risks actually are normally taken by the private sector in that respect. So those are some of the partnerships. And then the last aspect, which probably I would like to show before I go back to my presentation, is just to be able to understand actually that the government's role is always there in a PPP. And then the last one on the side is just to show the formation of a PPP. This is normally how it is normally set. As you can see, first of all, you have got the government as the client, and then you have got the SPC or the SPV, the special purpose vehicle or special purpose company, which in a normal situation, this company will be registered within that country or within South Africa or another country as any other company. It will be registered. The only difference, the registration of this company, is that the business of this company is only the project at hand. So the project which is going to be developed, the infrastructure project or whatever project, that is the only business this particular special purpose company can be involved with. And then you may find actually that the financing of a special purpose company or special purpose vehicle may be through equity and the long-term debt finance. And that decision may be made from the outset, where, for example, the government may say, we want the people to have a bit of a say and get shares in that. So you can have actually a portion of what is financing the SPV or the SPC coming from the equity. And then, of course, the rest of the financing may come from long-term debt finance. Now, when that special purpose company or special vehicle is put together, you'll have, of course, the financial advisors, the legal, all those people who are going to make sure that the deal is put together. And most of the time, we call these transaction advisors. And then you'll have various contracts to be able to put together the project. You'll have those who may be are going to operate the contract when it is finished and what have you. So I think in a nutshell, if I was talking about the anatomy of a public-private partnership or setup, I think those are very important aspects which I thought I should actually put in front. Then I can then move and go back to my presentation. Okay. Yeah. 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 So those challenges, I would like to go through them, and probably my starting point being the PPP preference in in developing countries or in emerging economies, and look at that, because to what extent actually can we talk with confidence about what has been happening there? I think the extension of PPPs hasn't been to the level of what was expected, and I think the reason why it hasn't been popular, as I've already indicated, it's more of the way in which PPPs are perceived, and this seems to be due to a lack of clear and consistent evidence that PPPs perform better than public sector organizations, because nobody has actually been able to say that with confidence and to show actually that is true. So while PPPs account for a share of the total infrastructure investment in emerging economies, I think it is normal for a country to use PPPs for only about 15 to 25% of total infrastructure investments. And even that, you cannot account it for across the board. So we talk about it, yes. We talk about preference, yes. But we don't actually see that PPPs have actually been extensively used as we were probably expected it that to be. So what is the problem? How can we deal with this particular situation? I think first of all is that the mixed elements of PPP contracts. I think there is a need, for example, to look at why it hasn't been extensively used. I think for me, I can say probably that a complex, long-term situation which I can see quite clearly is actually of looking at projects which have happened, and you'll find actually that reforms to legal and regulatory frameworks within which PPPs eventually would be structured, I think are critical in various countries, along with the help in improving government procedures for things like procurement and the construction management. So you'll find actually that because we are used to traditional ways of procuring, I think putting up a PPP has been a very probably complicated situation. Complicated because when you are dealing with PPP, if you compare with traditional, the professional experts you need are becoming even more, and you need actually those people who are well informed to be able to deal with the nitty-gritties of putting together PPP's projects. So if we can be able to deal with those particular situations, probably we stand a better chance of actually addressing, of probably making PPPs to be used a little bit more extensively. The complexity of the way we put them together vis-a-vis traditional ways. And secondly, look at the way in which the frameworks, the legal and regulatory frameworks are supposed to be. And thirdly, to have the professional people who can actually be able to deal with these situations in a more understanding and clearly to be able to deliver the project successfully. I think we haven't been able to do that. The second aspect, I think, which has actually become a bit of an albatross, is the question of costs and the profits. As we know, the private partner needs to make a profit, but the return, of course, should be reasonable. So the question of make profit and the return should be reasonable, it's another area which has created some issues. And the issues being that we need a balance. But who is going to ask them to the private sector to have a balance? I think will depend on your internal people you have, whether they are capable of being able to negotiate with the private concern and reach that particular point. That has been an issue which, of course, need to be dealt with.
Sorry,
because
just letting you know there's 5 minutes left.
Yeah, because there is an argument now that the profitability of private firms involved in PPP projects and the resulting cost for government and end users has long been a controversial subject, I think. I've seen some studies, for example, of the portfolio PPPs in the UK, especially in the health sector, where the rates of return are as high as 60%. And obviously, when you compare that to the traditional way in which we have procured, you won't find people, or you find probably people who would like actually to move into PPPs. So how do we deal with the challenges, I think, of costs and the profits? I think there are issues there which we need to address. First of all, the need to use blended finance, and you'll find actually that the argument is that if you use blended finance, it is possible to create a hybrid approach that combines PPP elements with those of more traditional public projects. The second point, which is being put across nowadays, is that if you are going to go for blended finance, normally you are going to put in subsidies, and the use of subsidies requires justification to ensure that it is really crowding in private finance rather than crowding it out. So you'll find sometimes somebody may tell you actually that you are actually financing the private sector to do public projects. So you need to have the ability to see actually how you can be able to combine those. Now, when the kind of analysis when a good analysis can be done of looking at the cost and profits together, what we call the cost benefit analysis, if it can be done properly, there is actually a chance that actually we could address some of the issues we are talking about here. If you look at one of the World Bank's independent evaluation group found that in 2010, the use of cost-benefit analysis, for example, dropped from 70% to all World Bank projects in 1970 to 25%. 1970 to 25% in 2008, and largely because of problems with getting sufficient data. So the difficulties of getting data are frustrating actually the ability to be able to do a cost-benefit analysis on this particular situation. Now, I think probably institutions like ours can do something about this, probably as a joint venture with the government and what have you. The third aspect, which I think has been coming out very strongly, is the costs of preparation of PPPs. There is an argument that there is a high cost of PPP projects preparation, especially when compared with the cost of traditional public procurement. Now, preparation costs, when we talk about preparation costs, we are talking about the legal, financial, and technical costs incurred by both public and private sectors as actors in emerging economies, where when you are putting together a PPP, you may actually have to pay for that. So the question which is being asked is there any other way of minimizing the preparation costs as the burden to those actually to those who actually were involved in preparation costs? In preparation must be, because there are so many aspects which are going to be done. And so if that is not going to be done properly, you may find actually things are not going to happen. So what should we do to be able to deal with the preparation costs? So PPP projects preparation costs, I think, especially in emerging economies, are much higher than they are in OECD countries. And why are they higher? I think there is an inclusion of upstream preparation, and you'll find actually that has made this to be a bit more expensive. And these costs are also considerably higher than for projects involving traditional public procurement. Why? Because of carrying out value for money analysis. Now, value for money analysis for me is important because if you cannot see the benefits of PPP over and above traditional, I don't see why you should go for PPP. So there is a need actually to look at these aspects of the preparation costs. And then there is an issue of finance and investment. There are clear arguments there on the finance and investment. A significant number of PPP advocates expect and sometimes promise that PPPs will lead to improved efficiency and the increase in investment from private sources, and consequently leading to greater service capacity and the coverage. That's an argument. But again, when you look at these particular projects very careful, I think the evidence suggests that this is not consistently the case. And if I look closely, I can still argue, I think various studies have done that private sources of finance have not played as strong a role in infrastructure PPPs in emerging economies as hoped. And in Africa, for example, including South Africa, I think the long-standing practice in some sectors of government on lending concession of finance to private concessionaires, I think it illustrates this particular fact. So significant concessions within emerging economies often need financial help because concessionaires could not or would not borrow to finance assets, with operational lifespans being much longer than the terms of the concession contracts. So probably there is a need to deal with some of those particular aspects there. So, but if I may ask a question again on this question of finance and investment, does it matter if private participation leads to operational efficiency, but not more in investment? I feel strongly that no. I think if there is operational efficiency, I think that could be enough. It doesn't have to lead to more investment at the same time. So again, different people probably will have different way of thinking. Now, much larger preparation platforms have been created, and I think more recently to try and address this particular problem. But in my view, when I look across, they do not yet had a chance to show results in terms of sustainable PPPs. So there is still something to be done there. Now, the question of poverty impacts, which most people are talking about, if a PPP generates investments, or even if it achieves only efficiency gains, it can make possible a host of other benefits like improved service quality, affordable tariffs, or expanded service access. Now, when we look at our emerging economies, these kinds of benefits are usually cited as justification for involving the private sector in infrastructure delivery. But again, there is relatively little empirical evidence that focuses on the development impacts of small or large-scale PPPs. What evidence there is, I think, suggests that such projects do not provide the poor with enough affordable access to services. Probably that's where we need to focus. And when I look at that particular situation, therefore, my argument is that there is so much we can do there. How can PPPs be done in such a way that the likelihood of development benefits is strongly increased? Now, PPPs that successfully generate benefits for the poor residents of emerging economies, I think usually begin with the realization that such benefits do not automatically result from increased private investment or improved efficiency. As long as private partners are mostly responsible for developing work plans as part of the bid process, and later during early stages of implementation, I think there is no reason to expect effective measures for benefit distribution. So my argument is that this is not a particularly new problem. PPPs, contract designs, and tariffs structures that fail to benefit or even disadvantage major constituencies of stakeholders have led to renegotiations and the project collapses from the early days of infrastructure concessions in the early 90s. And that's why many recommendations have been made about the need to undertake stakeholder analysis by modeling the distribution of project benefits before a contract has been awarded. But again, this kind of preparation requires financial resources and expertise that must be brought into play before PPP contracts are signed. So the other aspect which I think most of you have actually followed is the question of governance issues. Here, when we are talking about two various ways in which government's institutional capacity or lack thereof intentionally or unintentionally affects the performance of PPPs. Again, of course, there have been an issue of political leadership, which is normally a rare but highly important way in which governments can facilitate significant infrastructure investment via PPP arrangements. So when we talk about the question of governance, I think we need to be able to understand that governance structures under which most PPPs operate is usually defective. And this is largely because PPPs share many of the same defects as standard public works, including improper design, poor procurement, and frequent renegotiations, which are often opportunistic attempts by private contractors to increase profit. So we need to find a solution around there. But then what could be the solution here? Yeah, a recent study by the World Bank, I think Public-Private Infrastructure Advisory Facility, found that in the interest of getting projects to completion, many developing countries use limited competition and direct negotiation to procure private sponsors and operators. But PPIF also found that projects procured in this manner tended to be more expensive and are subject to more problems in implementation. So there is a problem there. And there is a need actually to be able to address that, because you need more to tender, so that probably you'll actually be able to get more of a price competition and what have you. The other aspect to
sorry,
yes?
So sorry to interject. Just a reminder to wind up now. Thank you.
Yes. The other aspect probably, which is more the last aspect of which is more transformation of PPPs, what is to be made of the G20 enthusiasm when they talk about transformation of PPPs. I don't think as if this, because of the reasons which I've just mentioned, PPPs haven't been taken to that level. Unless actually those particular aspects are dealt with, then probably we can talk about PPPs, but not necessarily transformational, but probably PPPs which are even encouraging small businesses to be involved. And that's why I'm actually arguing that there are very few examples of successful PPPs of transformational scale, but recommendations, I think, have been made regarding ways of avoiding problems with mega projects, which apply equally well to large PPPs. So there is a need to be the question of being skeptical of the number presented at appraisal, and of course the need to seek to debias estimates of time to task completion, costs, and benefits. And again, looking for evidence of meaningful cost-benefit analysis, as I said before. So if I was concluding, I think one aspect which there are a few more points which I have for conclusion, but I just want to summarize what I'm trying to say. I think PPPs have been taken sometimes as elite project delivery systems, and we haven't actually managed to reduce them to a point where we can deal with PPPs in a way in which people will be able to understand. But secondly, I think governments haven't managed actually to have expertise within where PPPs can actually become normal and they can actually be approached in a certain way. And thirdly, I don't think as if we should always talk about mega projects. We can even talk about PPPs, which are actually divided into smaller packets, and we can actually still benefit from those, provided there is sufficient expertise within the government units which are dealing with PPPs. And finally, probably one of the points which is coming out is that PPPs, about the first P is the public. So the question of stakeholders dealing with the first P, I think it becomes another aspect which need to be dealt with. And if there is proper public sector or what we'll call probably managing those who are going to benefit, or stakeholders, I think we may actually probably find a different situation when we are dealing with actually PPPs in that particular respect. So the last point, therefore, is that which I can probably conclude and say, I think there is sufficient evidence to suggest that compared with the traditional PPPs, model promoted in the 1990s, for example, successful PPPs today tend to be hybrids. I think combining some elements of traditional public-private partnership with those of consulting or EPC contracts, which we have done traditionally. And these hybrids involve less overall and lower risks for private sector operators and financiers, and more overall and more risk for governments and their development partners. So if we are going to think of PPPs as becoming very much used and benefiting our infrastructure provision as we want, I think probably we need to take a step back and try to make sure actually that we understand, and it's not always about bigger projects, but at the same time to be able to have sufficient expertise within government units to be able to deal with the private sector.
Thank you.
Well, I think there is nothing permanent except change, and PPPs have come over and above the traditional way of financing infrastructure. And I think the easier we understand them, well, we don't only leave this in the hands of those who are experts, but let the experts make them easy to understand, and let actually have expertise within the government to be able to understand them properly so that they can negotiate better. I think that's it today for today.
Okay, lovely. So yeah, thank you so much for that, Prof. Wilhelmina. I think you definitely provided us with a deep dive into the core elements of understanding what public-private partnerships are and how they function in relation to the government, and how I think your emphasis on developing a hybrid sort of agreement, I think that was very important, and important to make note of, but also important in our current economic climate. So thank you so much for that. Mzu, I just want to check if Prof. Pierce's presentation is ready. Will you be sharing that?
Yes, we will be sharing that. What do you see on the screen now?
And I just see, okay, here we go. And you can go into presenter mode. Okay, Prof. Pierce, I'm going to hand over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Risha, and thank you to Professor Wilhelmina for the interesting presentation, and I think one that's very relevant for us in the South African context and even here locally within Makhanda. I just think of some of the issues that have been arising the last 2 weeks with SAA Takatso deal, and that would have been some sort of public-private partnership that has now fallen apart, and debates around what is the fair value of the assets and allegations of the minister interfering in the process. We very close to home have wind farms coming up. There's a new project to the northeast of Makanda that's being planned. A lot of controversy around that, about whether that sort of development should happen or not. And years back, some will remember that there's been public-private partnerships for private hospital at our government hospital, the Settlers Hospital, and that eventually fell apart. We see debates in the newspaper with Netcare currently being in disputes with government health, Discovery raising all sorts of options of alternative healthcare provision and affordable healthcare options for private sector care. And so I think this whole debate around who should be providing what services is, I think, at the heart, Risha, of the theme that you introduced, which is about human and economic development. Who's best positioned to render the services that are needed? We've seen a lot of private sector involvement in security, in education, in health, and the like. We see government's role in these areas as well, but many state-owned operated companies not being successful, and then some public-private partnerships being experimented with, some effective and others not so effective. And so this, I think that's really the positioning of the seminar, is to talk about how do we develop people and the economy, and who does that. And I had the opportunity, Professor Wilhelmina, to look through your presentation ahead of this. And so in my response, what I'm wanting to do is to introduce a stakeholder theory perspective and to use stakeholder theory to maybe position some of what you've said. And I think that'll help us to frame further questions and answers, and might also then point to some ideas for further research as well. So if we, sorry, we're not moving on there, thank you. Right, if we just think about the idea of stakeholder theory, I think the recognition there is that even private sector organizations are no longer only responsible to their shareholders, but there's a whole range of other stakeholders who have a stake or an interest and expectation of such an organization. And so increasingly organizations need to be responding to these other stakeholders and take a responsible position in the way in which they conduct business. So this particular slide there just illustrates some of the stakeholder groupings that, for example, a large organization would be accountable to or would need to engage with in some way, and how they choose to engage with those range of stakeholders really becomes the question. Who are the primary stakeholders, and how do we meet those demands or expectations of such stakeholders or not? If we look at the kind of ideas that have been introduced so far from the presentation, I've pulled out some of the themes and related to them then to some of the stakeholder groupings that Professor Wilhelmina has identified, namely civil society as stakeholders. I think you started with that as one of the key focus areas. What about investors, the financing of these public-private partnerships? What's the role of government? What about suppliers, whether that be of the partnerships themselves or to those, if you think of your example of design, build and operate, the suppliers to those who then build ultimately the public-private partnership infrastructure or fixed capital projects. And then I also thought it's important to think about the customers or the public users. So if we think of this in the context of human and economic development, ultimately, who are the beneficiaries of these particular initiatives? And so as we've identified, just a short listing of some of these stakeholder groupings. On the right-hand side, then I've identified some of the interests and expectations that have come through with the presentation. So from the civil society point of view, what is their ideology? What is their belief about the role of state versus private versus partnerships in delivering such services? You raised questions about development versus dependence. do such partnerships create development, real development opportunities, or does it create further dependency? And are they functional? Are they working or not? And you've spoken about the increased focus of civil society and looking for evidence for that. In terms of investors, if we just focus on the private side of that investment for now, what is their return of investment? What is a reasonable investment versus what becomes excessive? And how is that determined? What is the time frame for a return of investment to be realized, especially in such large capital projects? What about environment, social, and governance considerations in relation to such investments as well? From a government perspective, again, the ideological position of government, do they see a role for investment in this area or not, of public-private partnerships or private providers themselves? I think of the energy mix in South Africa, the debates going on with, for example, wind farms, solar energy, and other alternative forms of investment, and the implication of that, not only in terms of the energy mix, but what does that do to local government funding, for example, if you've got renewables that are now being provided, or individuals provide for their own renewable energy sources, or companies do that, and government then no longer can charge for that kind of provision of power. What does it mean in terms of the budget allocations and the priorities of governments for that? And where do they place the bulk of their government expenditure? What does this then mean for the tax burden that can be relieved from taxpayers through financing coming from other sources? So I think these are some of the interests and expectations of government, who do want services to be rendered, at least in theory, who often struggle to do that in practice. And so who do they bring in to support with realizing that interest? And then from the customer or public user perspective, do they have access? What do they have access to? Does that service or that project actually perform as it should? Is it reliable or not? And what are they willing to pay for such a service or for such an infrastructure project, for example? So as we look at those different interests and expectations, there's then a couple of analytical frameworks or tools from stakeholder theory I want to just introduce briefly. The first is a stakeholder issues matrix. And so what I've done is I've taken the set of expectations and formulated them as key issues that have then come to the surface from your presentation, and they're listed on the left-hand side there. So performance and availability, reliability of particular services, the costing of that, what are the regulatory frameworks that are set up by governments for the management of those public-private partnerships, and then how those entities themselves governed. You've raised questions about that. What about the supply chain and how that's managed, and the procurement process for that becomes, I think, a critical issue. What about competition? Who can bid? How do they get the tender in the end as being the private partner in a public-private partnership, for example? And I'm sure there's other issues we could add to that. What the matrix then does is ask us to consider, and I've just given those 5 stakeholder groupings. What is, for example, civil society's interest in each of these issues? What is investors' interest, government, suppliers, and the public or the customer's interest? And ultimately then, are those issues, which are the most critical for them, which are the most important for them? So it's both qualifying the nature of such an issue for them and how important that is. And if we then start to populate this and we start to contrast, in other words, different kinds of issues and the interests of different stakeholders and the importance of that, then I think we start to see where the key touch points are, where the real points of contention are. And then from the perspective of a partnership entity, they can then start to identify what are those key issues they need to engage with what stakeholders to be able to realize the success of a particular initiative. Another analysis tool from stakeholder theory is the idea of a power versus interest grid. And what this reflects is that there's different levels of interest from different stakeholders on a particular issue, and that's shown on the y-axis, from a low interest to a high interest. And that high interest could either be positive or negative. So we've spoken about civil society groupings. Some might be very opposed to particular initiatives. Others might be very in favor and have a high interest in that. The other dimension is then about power. And so what is the level of power that a particular stakeholder has to ensure that their demands are realized or not? So we saw the minister this last week or so exercising his power to basically say the deal is off unless we can renegotiate it, and then Takatso withdrawing from that SAA deal. And so what this kind of power interest grid does is ask us to consider, I think, really who are the players, who's in the field of play, who's got high interest and high power to determine what the outcome will be, compared to who are the context setters, the crowd, and the subjects. And I think this raises one of the key points that you raised about the role of the G20. The group of 20 countries, I think even in the developing economy context and in the African context, are in that realm of players. So they can often dictate the terms of public-private partnerships and who gets what and who comes in as suppliers, for example, for particular initiatives. So I thought these would be useful insights then from a stakeholder theory point of view to then respond to the presentation by Professor Wilhelmina, who's then focused on these initiatives and some of their challenges. Thank you, Chair.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Prof. Pierce. I think that was definitely a well-crafted response. I think also your use of the stakeholder theory helped to frame the design of this public-private partnership, and I think it helped to map out the various ways in which these private and public partnerships can take place. And I think obviously it then ties in with what Prof. Wilhelmina was speaking about in the sense of like this hybrid sort of design where you have blended funding options and to basically get to the best possible setup for a particular project. And then I think also it definitely links to Prof. Wilhelmina's comment about having meaningful cost-benefit analysis in place, and I think in-depth stakeholder engagement would be another key sort of like feature of putting together, if I could say, the perfect public-private partnership deal. But yeah, so thank you so much for that response, Prof. Pierce. I think I'm definitely not going to take up any more time. I'm going to now explain how we're going to jump into the question and answer session. So what we will do is, so Mzu is my other sort of co-chair in the room, and what he will do is manage questions that come in from the in-person discussion, and we will address those questions first. If possible, we'll take 2 or 3 questions, and then we'll pose it to the speaker and the respondent, and then I will manage the questions that are coming in online. And then just a reminder for those of you who are joining us online, I'm sure the discussion has stirred up a few questions, a few thoughts that you may be like, I wonder, like, what does this mean for this? So please just pop those questions and those thoughts in the chat box, and then we will address them once we have addressed the questions coming in from the room. So Mzu, I'm going to hand over to you for a few minutes to gather any questions from the room. Thank you.
Okay, so I have a question. So it's sitting a bit far. Is it fine if I go ahead?
Yes, Prof, please do.
Okay. No, I don't see this slide anymore. Okay, so my question is to both Prof. Rodemila and Prof. Neil. I mean, maybe I must just start off by prefacing this and say maybe I'm a little bit too obsessed with the risks of such innovative ideas being corrupted by various interests, as Prof. Neil has put it, vested interests. And there's this case that just came to my mind as Prof. Rodemila was speaking of in the former Transkei in Port St. John's. A student tells me there was this big project to build a big bridge, biggest bridge in South Africa of its kind, to join two different mountains. And then the local government advertised for these projects for private involvement. They made the specifications in such a way that local providers could qualify because the project was small enough for local providers. And once the project was owned locally by a local firm, they then expanded the scope of the project. What ended up happening is that local providers were the leading partners in a project into which they had no adequate skills. And then they started offering contracts to Greenacres, but I don't remember some of these groups, big construction companies. And for me, that is just one example where the complexity that Prof. Rodemila describes by the various types of contracts that can be entered into in these PPPs could open up a window of innovative corruption. And Professor Neil adds onto that type of complexity when he then outlines the various needs of, I mean, you make the complexity even more in your face. You make it even more apparent by identifying, how do we identify the various stakeholders, the various interest groups. And then these are different types of contracts with different types of flexibility and innovation. So my question is, how do we know in a developing country context when the flexibility and the innovation in these systems is too complex and too risky and too open for potential hijacking by corrupt interests? So I'm posing these questions to both of you, whether or not we're thinking in this manner and whether there's research around this, etc. Thank you. Sorry, too very long-winded.
No, that's perfect. Are there any more questions from the room?
Dr. Nyangaruka, do you want to?
Yes, thank you so much for the two presentations and also for the insights on the work which can be done in partnership between the private and the government and the private. I'm more interested because it looks like the second presenter, Prof, you gave us an example of some failed exercises between the public and the private. I would want to know exactly what is it that can be done, because we might end up having more of this. Is this something where we can put a stopper on and stop this process and make sure that we have more successful stories than failed stories? And in the discussions, I think for both presentations, maybe it's the orientation of the seminar. We are talking about public and private partnership for infrastructure. we are based on in academic institutions. I would have been interested also maybe to have views on what is it that this public-private relationship can benefit researchers on public institutions like this one. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think if there are no more questions, I'm going to open it up to both of the profs to respond. I don't know. So first, Mzu, can I just confirm there's no more questions from the room, right?
There's
Let
one
me
more
just-
question.
Let me just add to
Okay.
what Prof. Daniel was saying, because he was
Sure.
talking about the successes of the PPPs. So I just want to ask if there's any, if there have been any successful PPPs where we can draw inspiration from, especially for future projects. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Franz. So I think we'll do it the other way around. I'll open it up to Prof. Pierce in the room to respond first, and then I will move over to Prof. Mila for him to respond, and then I will tackle a few questions that have been posted on the chat group. Thanks, Prof. Pierce.
Thank you. So I'll respond to all three questions, Sananisha.
That will be fine, yeah.
Okay, so the first one was the example of the Port St. John's Bridge, local providers getting the project, and then basically finding somebody else to actually do the work and subcontracting it to them. And I think the key question there is about what's the nature of the risks of doing so. I think from a stakeholder theory point of view, one of the, I think, good points about that example is that we need to get the buy-in from local communities for a project that is built. And often that comes about from engagement. It might just simply be about their participation in decision-making processes, or as your example here, where they then are awarded the contract. But certainly for many projects, and especially in mining, one of the key questions is around the social license to operate. Has that entity who's coming into that community obtained a social license to operate or not? So whether the community is bought in or not. So I think that dynamic's an important one for the success of the project, but then how is that managed? And I think your question was then really around how do you manage the risk of a local community then not having these skills to actually implement the project? And
Also,
was that assessed or not, right?
Yes, and also how do we know from an academic perspective whether or not the proposed innovative project in its complexity is appropriate for a particular community?
Yes, and you speak about the complexity of such a project, and I think even locally, those of you that are familiar with our schools here, there were projects to put fencing around the schools. And that became quite a complex project, as simple as it sounds, because what they did was they awarded different sections of the fencing to be set up by individual contractors. So for one school's fence, you might have had 10 different people that were contracted, or groups of people contracted to do that. And now you've got a project manager overseeing 10 groups that are involved with that. So the complexity, I think, brings about the risk that you were talking about.
Yes.
And it led to some of those projects being stalled. There were questions about how long each of them should take, when payment is made, and so on. So this is just a small project. You can imagine what it would look like if you had a complex project like building a bridge. And so I think it becomes not surprising, maybe with these larger projects that are complex, that there is a need then for a larger player to come into that, to at least take hold of that project. But then what do they do to at least involve locals in the project itself in terms of that construction project?
Pension,
Yes.
centralized project approach
That's
at
it.
the top-down level versus bottom-up,
Yes.
decentralized, involving local municipalities and communities there's a tension, and then there's
Yes.
the scale of complexity that then determines where do we go, central or decentralized.
Yes, and just one of those variables in that level of complexity is, do I get paid for the number of days I take to complete a project, or do I get paid for completion of the project?
Yes, yes.
So are those details specified in the contract, for example? I think the other thing that's happened in that construction space has been, and we've seen this in the newspapers, this idea of the emergence of what's been referred to as the construction mafia in South Africa, where we've got what started out maybe as local communities that were then as an intermediary, others now assisting them with that, and then always trying to monopolize or hold the industry to ransom. So that becomes a high risk for even private construction companies to go into an area to do some sort of construction, but that's been enabled by these kind of partnership relationships. In terms of the second question, that was about failed projects and their successes and how we get to those successes. I think what I've tried to present in my framework or framing of it from a stakeholder theory perspective is to really ask the question about, are we really thinking deeply enough about who the different stakeholders are and what their interests are, and how then do we manage these competing interests? And it raises that question of complexity again, that it becomes increasingly complex. And so I think it's these kind of analytical tools that would help both from a government point of view when they're starting to initiate such a project, but also from whatever that entity is that now has to govern that project in a collaborative way, for them to start to consider who are their stakeholders and what are the key issues that arise from those sets of expectations and needs. And so then how do we manage stakeholders and their expectations, or the relationship rather with the stakeholders? You can't manage them directly, but how do we manage those expectations? And some of the stakeholder literature talks about different levels of engagement. So that means relationship management of stakeholders becomes an important area for ensuring success. And I think that also provides an area for possible research endeavor to look at how can we further investigate the stakeholder management process or relationship management process. And then I think that touches on the third question about successful PPPs that you raised, but I think it was also asking Professor Wilhelmina to give examples of where are these success cases that we can use as a comparison. I think it'd be useful to look at those cases from a stakeholder theory perspective and say, did they apply certain of these principles or perspectives, and did they work or not because of that? Or was there something else? Thank you.
Almost feels like an issue of leadership, actually.
There are leadership aspects because, and I think it's also collaborative leadership. So often we think of leadership in a singular way, who's the individual. But if we're talking about a partnership, then we've got collaborative governance, and we've got a team of leaders that need to work together and need to figure out how to work together to be able to lead the project.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I just wanted to check if you wanted to add anything to the discussion, Prof. Wilhelmina.
Yeah, yes, Risha. I think, well, I was actually listening very carefully to Professor Pierce's argument, and probably before I answer the questions, I just wanted to say, I wish if, you know, you could have said some of these words when they were conceptualizing the e-toll in Gauteng, because they forgot us, who are going to pay for the tariffs, and now they are paying a big price because we are not paying. And clearly you could see actually that the stakeholders model you are presenting is spot on. It's something which project managers of projects of that size, they needed to understand. And no one actually tried. Even me, I was fooled. I thought this was just the offshoots of the World Cup. And when I saw the countries being built, that's when I knew that these people, they didn't think about the stakeholders at all. I want to thank you for that. Now, Now I go to the first question. I think Professor Mbata, what he was sketching is something else, which could happen actually in an environment where a project is put together, and the model or of delivering the project in certain situations actually denies people within that particular locality any chance of benefiting from that project. Now, for me, every project starts from planning. There is the conception phase of the project where you need to look at the environment. You need to be able to say, this is how the project is going to be delivered. But there are sometimes when things happen, you don't understand actually how the decisions were taken. And when decisions are taken where the project itself, before even it starts, it creates this problem, then you'll find actually that even the local people actually become a bit negative against the project, what is going to happen. Now, and this is why I think the G20, I think Professor Pace spoke about it a little bit. When they talk about big projects, in most situations, they are talking about big companies coming from the north to work on projects in Africa in that situation. And if that happens, obviously, you are not going to expect any benefit from those actually who are within the areas where those projects are. So my argument is that whatever complexity, whatever risks you are going to get on a project, all these things are supposed to be determined from the beginning. And it is by understanding actually the area and the people who are, I mean, you will call stakeholders, I think in this respect, to be able to understand them, as Professor Peace was trying actually to discuss, that's when you can put a better delivery system. Otherwise, you'll find actually that most of the problems actually start from the beginning. And that's why almost all the PPPs which haven't done very well, the problems started from conception. On the second question, I think what can be done? I think that was a very good question, and probably what can the universities probably role be? I think both are very important. I think for me, the first thing what should be done is that the public sector or the government in this case, I think they need to be really well prepared within to be able to deal with the intricacies of PPPs. And when I say they need to be prepared, it is first of all to have the legal framework, which is completely dealing with the issue, all the issues first. And the secondly is actually to have the units which are dealing with PPP with proper staff. People who are working there must be capable of understanding the nitty-gritty of PPPs. We need to have people within those offices who can actually stand as transaction advisors, whether within the government or in the private sector. If those things are not addressed, I think it will always be a big problem. Now, the universities, we can provide a lot. I think the first thing we can provide, there are so many PPPs which have failed, whether in South Africa or beyond. If we can actually start looking at why did this project fail, probably we can actually provide guidance in terms of what was not done properly and what have you. But on the other side, we can actually try to address the myth of these big projects. And one of the examples which I think two examples which I can give you, two of my doctoral students at UNISA, one has done something on how to reduce these big projects into smaller projects. And the other one was actually more looking at how to integrate small contractors into these projects. And the third one is now what is being done under this particular unit, which is actually trying to look on how to improve the value creation within a PPP. So there are so many things we can be able to do. And the last one, what are success stories? That's a very interesting question. I think I may start. I think charity starts from home. I think in South Africa we have got two success stories. The first success story is if you look at the national highways in South Africa, I think is a success story on PPPs. I think I can say probably more than 80% of the national roads, they seem to be managed properly. The second success story, I think, is the GAU train. If you look at the GAU train in terms of assessment, you'll find actually that it started very badly, but it has done very well. So those are success stories. We can start there. And there are other success stories, for example, in countries like Thailand, which we know, in some parts of Australia, which we can actually be able to pinpoint and say these are success stories. But for me, all the time, a success story must be coupled with a bad story as well. And those which are not success stories, we need as well to highlight them and to see why they were not successful. I think I want to pause there.
Thank you. Perfect, Prof. Wilhelmina. So what I'm going to do now is we have 2 questions from our online guests, which I'm going to read out.
Yes.
Okay, so then the first one is from Aaron. Who
Risha,
said
sorry,
Yeah.
if you can allow them to speak, it's fine, if they can.
Oh, okay, I can do that. Aaron, would you like to read out your question or pose your question? Please unmute yourself and go ahead. Aaron Stain.
Good afternoon.
Good
I do
afternoon.
find this presentation extremely interesting and useful. We've been talking about PPPs for many, many years. I was in Parliament since 2004, and it was already discussed then, but it's never really been implemented. And where there was an attempt, it hasn't been successful. Now, I do know that the South African government is not very keen on PPPs. Does your panelists have any ideas why they are so afraid for entering into PPPs, considering that we're a developing country and we need both the finance as well as the expertise from the private sector? I know there's talk now, in particular with generating more electricity and so on. But, you know, from their experience, do they know why it's such a no-no for the South African government? Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. I'm going to open it up to Prof. Wilhelmina to respond, and then Prof. Pierce.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for that question. Well, I don't know. I think I needed to answer all this question by putting a context. You know, for me, I normally say that if you are an organization, whether public or private, and you want to enter into negotiation with the private sector, I normally argue that internally you need to have people who can measure up to those you are going to negotiate with if you want to get something from that negotiation. Now, PPPs are not different from that. Although the government puts most of the risks to the private sector, but there is a very critical negotiation which the government does with the private sector when they are trying to agree, for example, how long is going to be the concession, what will be the tariffs which are going to be paid, because those are going to touch on profits and what have you. And in my view, I've come to realize that sometimes the government feels a bit uncomfortable because they don't seem to be well glued up with what is supposed to happen. And when I say they are not, it's because they haven't actually managed to bring in expertise internally with people who can actually be able to negotiate at a level where they will actually be able to be listened to. And I find actually for not being prepared to have the right cohorts of people who are experts who can do those things, I think that makes them a bit uncomfortable to open up actually very much into PPPs. And so unless that is actually addressed, and probably that's another area which I think the second question before was asking, probably business schools should try to look into how they can produce probably balance the transaction advisors. And I find actually that's why the problem is. I think that's how I would like to answer that question.
Thank you. Prof. Pierce,
Thank you.
Comment?
Yes, maybe just one comment from myself, and I think that we need to acknowledge the role of the ideology of governments as well. And if we look at our own situation where we have the tripartite alliance between the ANC, the Communist Party and trade unions, the Communist Party itself, as well as trade unions, are very suspicious of private sector involvement in what they would view as government affairs. And so I think there's pressure coming from that quarter to rather say, let's grow and develop our state-owned enterprises rather than have these public-private partnerships.
Sorry, Risha, can I just maybe say just a comment? I'm really surprised that there's that sentiment now. I would have imagined it in the just after 1994, you know? But now with state capture, with such an entrenched level of corruption, I've always felt like there's a stronger move and willingness from ANC cadres to capture these processes, you know, procurement processes for the public sector by creating smaller companies that, yeah, so maybe the system is changing, but the incentives are not for efficiency and social welfare, but for just, you know, self-enrichment.
Yeah, I think there's that aspect too, correct.
Thank you. And then we have one more question from Sam. Sam, would you like to unmute and share a question with us?
Sure.
Thank
Thanks. Yeah, just very quickly, I was also interested in this issue of, you know, how we oversee the whole thing and so basically my question is, who is the right authority, if one can speak in general terms about such things, for overseeing these kind of processes, you know, to avoid corruption or fuzzy issues like unsolicited proposals. And then I know very little about the subject, so in relation to it, I was also just wondering whether people like competition authorities and stuff also tend to get involved. Okay, that's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Sam.
So I didn't get the last word. You say the competition commission.
The national competition authorities, do they ever step into such things?
You mean to be involved in PPPs?
In the oversight of potential corruption in the contracting. Or,
Potential.
Yeah.
Yeah. But are you asking whether there's a potential of corruption happening, or you're asking whether that could be the reason why?
I'm asking whether in the oversight of the processes to avoid corruption, whether the competition authorities have ever become involved, or whether that makes any kind of sense.
Oh, okay. I get it. Yeah. I think for me, yes, actually, one aspect which I think I mentioned in my presentation was the observation that governments, because they don't have capacity, they have a tendency of trying to reduce those private companies who are going to be involved. Now, that is reducing competition, and reducing competition is actually against the law in South Africa. So yes, actually the Competition Commission, actually they need to be involved, because most of the procurement systems which are used, they need to be fair and they need to be open and they need to encourage that. So I think whenever you are putting together a contract like that or any project like that, of course the rules or the laws of the country apply. And yeah, the National Competition Commission is actually supposed to be involved in case actually there are issues which could happen. And I think, I don't know if you know this, during the World Cup, because we have the oligopoly problem in South Africa, we had about 6 construction companies which could tender for bigger projects like those. And because they were very few, they actually colluded. And they colluded to the extent that the country actually, I think the government pays an arm and a leg. But later on, they were caught. And the Competition Commission actually is the one which actually managed the whole process to try and know who are the culprits and those actually who are supposed to pay the fines. So yes, actually the National Competition Commission is supposed to be involved in projects of this nature, no doubt about it. I pause there.
Thank you, Prof. Wilhelmina. Prof. Pierce, I'm not sure if you want to respond to that last question.
Thank you. Sam, if I can respond to maybe the first part of your question then, because we've got an answer to the question about the competition authorities. But I think you were raising a broader question around governance and governance structures. And I think when we think about governance in these projects, I think we must first separate out what is the role of government in creating an enabling environment through legislation that it puts in place, and separate that out then from, now that we have a public partnership arrangement or entity that's been created, how is it governed? And I think often we think of it from the perspective of having a singular board of governance, but often projects like this, given their complexity of, in particular, the range of different stakeholders and their interest in it, we maybe need to look at what would be referred to as polycentric governance arrangements, where there's different centers of governance focusing on different aspects. And that does introduce its own complexity then of governance arrangements and how those bodies interface with one another, report to one another, or communicate with one another. But I think it does more accurately then start to reflect the range of different stakeholders' interests. So how do we then structure the governance arrangements in a way that then is in the best interest of the project overall and of the various stakeholders involved? Where are their interests best represented?
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I think just bringing in this whole other dimension of polycentric, of a polycentric arrangement of governance adds like another layer to this very complex sort of arrangement of PPEs, which I think is obviously worth exploring in the move towards having more successful PPEs and more buy-in to PPEs, especially if we work towards the end goal of improving service delivery, and obviously we highlighted that link to human development and human rights. So thank you so much for that, Prof. Pierce. So before we end, I just wanted to check if Profs Pierce and Wilhelmina have any closing comments. Prof. Wilhelmina, let me first check with you. Do you have any closing comments, closing notes?
Yeah, yes, Resha, thank you very much. Okay. Can I just say, I'm normally reluctant to say this, but I have to say it because if I look at the people who are attending and listening to some of the questions, there is another problem, which is a big elephant in the room. And this big elephant in the room is about project management. I think project management as a discipline, in my view, has some problems. And what are the and I think there are some issues of PPPs which are originating from that problem. What is the problem? The problem, project management has become so popular across the world to an extent that sometimes you can have a person calling himself or herself a project manager after a one-day course. Now, that for me has created a problem, because any profession, as far as I understand, it has got two parts which you cannot entangle, you cannot probably forget. One, you need the knowledge base. You need to have a certain knowledge base. That's the first part. The second part, you need to have certain skills, which of course is you practicing what you studied. Now, project management has become so popular to an extent that people who manage projects, most of them, I call them accidental project managers. It's just a person, he gets the title and he goes for it. There is no knowledge, there is nothing. If there is a knowledge, it's just bit by bit. Now, that to me is another problem, which I think if you look at people who become in charge of these projects, sometimes most of these people, they are not up to it. If you are saying, let me look at the knowledge base of this particular person, let me look at the skills of this particular person, you may find actually that they are not up to the level on what you'll expect. And then you can ask yourself, if the pilot who is actually in the cockpit doesn't know how to move the plane, then you will actually ask yourself whether the plane is going to reach anywhere. So I have that problem, and I think I should just say that. The last point is about risk which are involved in a PPP project, because the private sector does not come into PPP just for the sake of it. They want to maximize profit. Now, if the people whom they are going to negotiate with are not at the level to be able to make sure actually that even the government comes out of negotiations to a level which is acceptable, then you have a problem, because the private sector will go for a jugular and they will go for it. So unless we solve some of those particular situations, I think PPPs are going to remain an issue for time to come. I think I just want to pause there.
So you're talking about all of us here, because in academia, we all manage projects, you know, without project management education.
Yeah. Actually, there are some organizations which even give titles. They will call you a project professional after you have done a course for 2 months, and I don't think so. I don't think so. I think project management is not as simple as that. There is no profession which you can just get just as easy as that. So, and because we haven't taken note of that, sometimes I think we are in trouble. Well, even within universities, we can give somebody a job to manage a big takeover of something, but actually that person has got no skill, has got no knowledge at all. So
point taken.
It's an issue. Yeah, it's an issue for me.
No, and I have to agree.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for those closing comments, Prof. Wilhelmina. Prof. Pierce, can I hand over to you for some closing thoughts?
Thank you. Yes, I want to pick up on one of the ideas earlier on from Professor Wilhelmina, where he spoke about this idea of transaction advisors, and that maybe there's a developmental role for example, universities to develop people who have this capability to be advisors, whether it be to government or to the PPP itself. And that got me thinking, if I look back at this the seminar this afternoon, such a person would need to be developed in a range of disciplines, not only in project management, which obviously would be quite fundamental to this. And I pick up now on the idea of developing people, but also maybe a research agenda and how you start to research something like PPPs. And I think we need to look at it from whether it be a multi or inter or transdisciplinary perspective. I think just in today, we've drawn from public management, project management, economics, ethics and governance, finance, politics, management. And how do you bring all of those and others together to really create this proper understanding of how public-private partnerships should work and how they should be managed effectively? So I think that positions maybe further research areas, but then also a role for universities possibly to develop people, to give them the kind of knowledge required to either advise or to lead such projects. Thank you, Chair.
Quite agree with that. Yeah, that's a good point.
Perfect. Thank you, Prof. Pierce. So on that note, I want to once again offer my warmest thank yous to Prof. Pierce and Prof. Wilhelmina for your time this afternoon and for your very insightful and thought-provoking discussions on this very, I think, definitely interesting issue, but also a very pertinent issue as we look to more development projects in South Africa, and obviously look to more of these sorts of partnerships taking place. Yes, so And thank you to everyone as well online who has joined us this afternoon. And please note that the recording is available or will be made available on our social media channels, and you're also welcome to follow us on these platforms. So thank you so much again to everyone, and have a good afternoon. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Mukate. I think I saw you there. Dr. Mukate is my former boss. Okay.